Hello, I'm Liselle Sambury. I'm a young adult author, and today we are doing a craft style video all about breaking down the fun and games. So I will say, and I always do this disclaimer, but I'm doing it again just in case you're new to my channel. I am going to be showing you how I break down the fun and games. So if you follow Save the Cat, which is a type of outlining structure, it started as Save the Cat, which was more for screenwriting. And since then, Jessica Brody wrote a book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is a very popular writing craft book that breaks down the whole process. And one of these sections that she's broken it into is fun and games. And the thing about fun and games is that it is incredibly vague. I love Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I think it is an amazing writing craft book, but I think the fun and games section is the worst section of that entire book. I think it is just like, it's so incredibly vague to the point where it's so confusing to know what to put in that chunk. And it's 20 to 50% of the book. So it's 30% of the book. And it's like, the explanation is some sort of like hand wavy thing that is very not helpful. And so over time, I've been able to develop a method for breaking down the fun and games into something kind of more formulaic that I found has worked really well for me. I use this process for writing my sequel to Blood Like Magic, which is my debut novel. I've used this process for writing my horror, which is currently on submission. I've used this process several times, and each time I find that it's like very helpful to me, and it's just like a method that really works for me. So that's why I'm saying I'm breaking down the fun and games. I'm providing that craft advice, but this is just how I do it. If you disagree with it, that's totally fine. You don't have to follow this method. This isn't like the method. Jessica Brody hasn't like anointed me to say, yes, you may tell them how to structure the fun and games. This is just what I do. So I'm going to share that with you, and I hope that will be helpful for you. Something I've also done brand new for me is I have included a little cheat sheet. The link for it is in the description. You can just download it. You don't need to sign up for my newsletter or anything. I have a newsletter, but I never use it and I don't care. So you can just go to my website and just download it for free. And it basically just like lists out all the points that I'm going to talk about in this video. And it also has an example so that you can see the example that I use, which is the same example I'm going to use in this video. Of course, you'll need to watch this video for the sheet to make sense to you. If you just download the sheet, it's going to kind of be confusing. But it's just for your reference so that if you ever, after watching this video, are like, man, I want to like use those steps, you can just pull up that sheet and use it. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we start, I know I just rambled, but before we start, I am going to be referencing the Save the Cat beats. If you don't know what those are, I posted a link in the description that shows you what all the Save the Cat beats are. I highly recommend checking that out before watching this video because otherwise it's going to be confusing for you. Yes, so now that I've said that, we can move on. Step number 1 is math stuff. Yes, you must do math. You must do math if you want to follow my method. So Jessica Brody, I'm going to reference her because I've read the whole of Save the Cat Writes a Novel and I didn't read Save the Cat. So she says that the fun and games section is 20 to 50% of your novel. So that means it's 30% of the whole book, as I said before. So this is important because you want to keep within that percentage. This is just for pacing reasons so that your fun games isn't like super, super long when it isn't supposed to be or super, super short, things like that. I follow this because this really helps me with my pacing. I used to have a lot of issues with pacing in my other books, but since I've been using the Save the Cat model and I try my very best to stay within those percentages, my pacing is a lot better and I don't really get comments on pacing anymore. Comments from like my agent or my editor being like, the pacing is bad. So basically what you want to do is you want to figure out your final word count. So how long is the project going to be? So I will use an example. So the example that I'm going to be using throughout this video is for a YA contemporary fantasy. This is based on my first failed novel, which was about werewolves and was a Twilight ripoff and will never see the light of day. And so I feel fine using it as an example for this and spoiling everything because I'm never going to write it because it's bad. So if you're like, wow, this example book is bad, yes, it is, and that's okay. It's just an example. So this YA contemporary fantasy about werewolves, just to give you a little brief synopsis, it's about a girl living in a small town. She's actually an adult woman. I queried this as YA. Why? I don't know. But she's an adult woman. And she discovers the secret of werewolves, and now they want to kill her. And she finds a werewolf who happens to live in her town, and it turns out he's the disgraced prince. And if she is able to help him return to his throne, he will pardon her and she won't be murdered and she'll get to return to her everyday life. So yeah, so that's the premise. Anyway, we're talking about math, aren't we? So that book, the estimated word count would be 100,000 words, which is usually what I go for with YA fantasy. That means the fun and games would start at 20K and it would end at 50K, essentially. And so now you want to think about how long your chapters are. My chapters tend to be 2,500 words each. And so you have 30K, 30,000 divided by 2,500, that's 12. So that means there's 12 chapters in the fun and game section. So you work out that math however it works for you. I find this is best because this is how you can plan all those different chapters. It's easier to do that planning when you know how many chapters you're going to have. Step 2. Figure out what your main character's external and internal goals are. These will be important for reasons I will discuss in step 3, but for this point, you just need to figure out what the external and internal goals are. This is important just, I think, in novel writing in general, but the external goal is the thing on the surface that your main character is trying to achieve, and the internal goal is the thing inside them for their, growth as a character that they need to achieve in order to have that positive character arc. So in the case of this example, the external goal of the character is to reach the werewolf palace so that she can reinstate the werewolf prince to his station so that he may pardon her and she can go back to her everyday normal life. And the internal goal is for her to realize that it's not always better to go it alone, because her whole fatal flaw or the lie she believes is that it's always better to just do everything by yourself because then you can never be hurt by people. And in this case, she needs to learn the opposite. Step number 3 is to decide on your subplots. There are a lot of things to consider with subplots, but first I'm going to explain to you what a subplot is because I didn't know. And once I learned what they were, I found that it made a huge difference to my writing. I rely heavily on subplots for forming the fun and games and quite honestly for forming the entire middle of my novel because I found that since I started doing that, it has made my books have a lot more depth, been a lot more interesting, not only for readers, but for me writing it. And I find that I get a lot of good ideas from writing the subplot to weave in, and it just adds a lot more depth to the book. And I think it's super, super helpful. And so I rely on those very, very heavily to form the entire fun and game section. So this is just going to become the subplot chat at this point, but I will explain to you what a subplot is again, because I didn't know. So a subplot is what it sounds like. It is a subplot. So it is a plot away from the main plot that helps your main character develop the skills to then take on the main plot or succeed, etc. Or maybe fail if you have a negative character arc, but usually succeed because you'll usually have a positive character arc. And so that's essentially what the subplot is. Things you want to think about when you are deciding on your subplot. And this is why I had you decide your external and internal goals before. So the subplots should help the main character develop the skills to not only take on the main plot, but also to develop their internal goals. goals. So they're pretty much developing both at the same time. It's also delivering on the promise of the premise. This is like the only clue that you get from my memory of Save the Cat Writes a Novel of how to structure your fun and games, which is the promise of the premise, which feels so vague, but it's essentially delivering what you said the book would give. So for example, in this example that I'm presenting, a contemporary fantasy, which is essentially a paranormal since it's about werewolves. So things that people are expecting is romance. A bunch of romance because it's kind of paranormal romancy, werewolves, so maybe like some werewolf fights. When you say werewolf prince and royalty, some royalty aspects. You say there's a journey, so they want to see the journey, things like that. So essentially, whatever you mention in your synopsis that is going to happen, that's aside from the main plot. And things too, like if your book is about a character discovering a love of music. So maybe they want to like road trip and follow a band around. So like the main plot is them following the band, but they're also discovering like a love of music. So they might like attend concerts, go to like music stores. They might like hang out with a bunch of people that love music. Maybe they learn to play an instrument. All those sorts of things that people are expecting to see in the book. And so those are the things that come with deciding on the subplots. Something you also want to keep in mind when you are deciding on your subplots is that you want there to be wins and losses. So the fun and game should be like, it should be like a little waveform. The character should have some highs and some lows. And so what I like to do when I decide on my subplots is I like to mark whether they're a win or a loss for the main character. And so that way I kind of know when I write it, whether it's going to be an up and down for them. And you do want to have ups and downs. If you only have ups or only have downs, I feel like it's going to be too much. So that's at least my opinion. And then these subplots, of course, are going to lead to the midpoint. And when you get to the midpoint, you'll have the midpoint turn. This usually means that your character will have a false victory or a false defeat. So if you mostly have wins, then probably they're going to have a false victory. And if you mostly have like fails in the subplots, they're probably by midpoint going to have a false defeat. And so that's something to think about as well with your planning. So now, what should your subplots be? So I'm going to share some examples again for this example of what the subplots could be. So I decided on 3 plus the B plot, which is always there. So the B plot is a romance between the disgraced werewolf prince and the main girl or woman. And then the first subplot is they need to go and find allies so that they can have people to help them reinstate him in the werewolf court. So that's the first thing. They got to find allies and win them over to their side. Second subplot is that the current werewolf prince has a sort of missing bride who he really wants to find, and you could probably gain a lot of favor with him if you found her. So that's a mystery and that's ongoing. And then 3 is that the main character is being haunted by the literal ghost of her abusive mother. So that's another thing. So those are 4 subplots all together. So how are these working on the different goals? So the B plot is its own thing. He is supposed to help her understand that it's not better to go it alone. So that's his own function. The subplot of finding allies, that pushes to develop the skills for the external goal because they need to gather those people in order to then go fight the royalty. So that develops external goal. Also, while there's going to be a love rival, who the main character becomes friends with, who kind of helps her see that like maybe it's not better to go it alone. The subplot of the missing bride, this can be a step towards the main goal because the main character thinks if they find this bride, it'll be easier for them to have leverage over the main prince to try and make him step down, maybe non-violently. And of course, during this mystery that she's going to try and solve by herself, and it's not going to work out for her that way. And she's going to realize, wow, if I like trusted people to help me and didn't try and go it alone, maybe I could do this. And then the third thing, the like ghost of her mother thing, is like the whole thing of, you know, I'm trying to deal with this by myself, but if I told other people, then, you know, maybe it would be easier for me to overcome this. Again, internal goal stuff. And so I decided finding the family allies would be like a win, that the dealing with the ghost mother thing would be a loss, that wouldn't work out for her, and then the whole missing bride thing would like kind of be a loss, but then later be a win. That one's a little bit harder. So I'll explain why that is weird. So basically how I go about things is I will try and wrap up roughly half of the subplots before I hit the midpoint. And so I do that because it helps kind of wrap them up there, but it also doesn't give me too much to work with in the second half of the book, because you do want to get back to your main plot and you don't want to be bogged down with so many things. So that's why I kind of suggest that. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes your subplots may continue on longer than you want, but I do think it's helpful to kind of plan which subplots are going to stretch past the midpoint and which are going to end before the midpoint. Because sometimes you can, like in the case of that subplot I mentioned with the mystery, you can at the midpoint have that subplot turn into like a false victory or a false defeat. And then later on in the second half of the middle, they can maybe have that turn into a victory. I hope that's not too confusing. You can, again, in the example that I posted in the description, you can see the full example of like the 12 chapters I've planned out, and hopefully that will help you. But essentially, like this process isn't super hard and fast. There's lots of room for flexibility, but you just kind of have to think of how you want everything to fit and how you want everything to shape up, just so that you know what you're doing essentially and know when to stop things and when to finish things. But I think you don't want to get to the midpoint and have no subplots wrapped up. I think you at least need to have one. Again, I recommend having roughly half, but it really depends on you. I just find that if you get to the midpoint and you don't wrap up enough subplots, then you have so much to do in the second half of the middle, and it can make it too long and it can throw off your pacing. Because when you get to the third act, like in the way I structure my novels, you really want to be focusing on the main plot. And if you have a bunch, like a ton of subplots going into the third act, you are going to have to wrap up so many things so fast, and it's going to make your ending feel rushed, and kind of messy. So that's why I recommend that. Now that you have your subplots all planned out, what I will do is I will make a bullet point of things that can happen in that subplot. This is to help jog and give me ideas for chapters. So in the B plot, I'll write things like, they find out things they like about each other, they have fights, there's a jealousy over a love rival, they kind of cut themselves off from each other. If you have ever read Romancing the Beats by Gwen Hayes, which I really recommend, that has like more specific instructions about how you can plot out romance so that you can use those as well. But yeah, so those are things that might happen. For example, with the mystery of like the missing bride, they need to investigate, they need to learn about the mystery, they need to find clues, they need to get stomped up by red herrings, they need to maybe think they figured it out, but then they haven't, they need to accuse people. Like those are different things that can happen. etc. So you kind of get the idea. You're just making bullet points of the things that can happen in that subplot to give you chapter ideas, so that later when you're trying to figure out what your chapters are, you're like, okay, this is kind of the stuff that needs to happen. And when I write these down, I will keep in mind, again, the internal goal of the character. So the character needs to kind of learn not to go it alone. So you may have things that kind of reinforce that, yeah, that's definitely what I should do, or fight against that belief. And so I'll write out things like that when I'm planning these as well. So like the whole mystery of the bride thing, she tries to investigate by herself, thinks that this is like the better way, but what she has figured out is actually wrong. So later on, she can figure out how to do it right by working together with people, that sort of thing. So that's essentially kind of the bullet points you want to make on those subplots so that you know what you're going to go forward with into the next step. Step number 4 is planning your chapters. So remember the math we did in step number 1, you know how many chapters are in your fun and games section. In my case of this example, it is 12. So then I will write out a numbered list, 1 to 12, or like if I'm doing it within the context of my bigger chapter outline, then it'll just be whatever chapters are next, but it'll be 12 chapters in all. And then I will look at my subplots list and my list of things that need to happen in the subplots, and I will start randomly plotting in chapters. I will say this process is very chaotic. I literally will just go in and I'll throw in the stuff, the little bullet points of things that I said that needed to happen, and I will throw them in just randomly, so that I can fill up all the chapter spots. And once I've got them all filled, I will look at it and I will try and think of how to do it logically. So in the case of this example, throw up those plot points. If you want to look at the exact chapter points that I picked for this, download that free sheet. I have the full example there with all of those. But essentially I'll do those and then I'll kind of decide on different things. So the first thing I would decide on was in order. So I want them to go find allies first. I want the ghost mom thing to stretch past the midpoint. So that's going to happen all the way through. The B story will stretch past the midpoint. So that's going to happen all the way through. And then I kind of want the missing bride thing. I want there to be a little false victory and then have it continue a little bit past the midpoint. So this is why I say the rule about like finishing roughly half before the midpoint is flexible, because in this case, obviously I haven't finished roughly half, but I know in my mind which ones are going to stop and finish at which points, essentially. So then when I'm doing my chapter planning, I can reorganize because I know that all the subplot stuff about finding allies in that family will happen in the first chunk of the fun and games, and that whole subplot will wrap up. And then they'll continue on with the other subplots, which again, I've slotted in fairly randomly. And that's basically how I plan out that fun and games section. The main thing to me is that you make sure it makes coherent sense. So you want the wins and you want the losses, you want this like up and down thing happening, but like you also want it to be legitimate. So you don't want up one chapter, down one chapter, up one chapter. That's like a lot. So you might rearrange your subplot chapters so that it seems like, okay, this chunk, it seems like she's winning. And then in this chunk, she's kind of having the loss. And then in this chunk, she's kind of having the win. And then just kind of figuring out how to coherently weave these together. So even though this is the most formulaic I can get it, this whole planning chapter bit is still gonna be really up to you and your story and deciding how that all works together and finessing that and like working with that. So I got you as far as like deciding on your subplots and knowing that you're gonna rely on subplots and figuring out what should happen, but you have to figure out the order and the flow and how all those things are going to work together in order to plan out those chapters. Step number 5, I basically talked about this in step number 4, but this continues beyond the fun and games, actually, past your middle, and it's just for you to mark off where those subplots are going to finish so that you kind of have at least a vague idea of where things are going so that it can help you construct your fun and games. Because if you know that like very shortly after your middle, the subplot is going to be finished off, then probably you want the meat of the subplot to be in the fun and games. But if you know that like the subplot that's happening in the fun and games is going to go all the way to the end of the book, then maybe, you know, you kind of only want to get to the 50% mark by the midpoint of that subplot, so not everything will be developed. This is to just kind of help you plan pacing a little bit better. This is a bit more vague. I'm sorry for that, but it's to help not bog you down, because we are concentrating on the fun and game section. We're not really getting into all of the other sections, which are a lot more succinctly planned out for you in like the whole Save the Cat Writes a Novel thing. But because you've started these subplots, I think it's really helpful to just kind of put a marker of where they're going to end, just so that you know how much you're doing in the fun and games and how much is going to be done later. That is the entirety of how I structure the fun and game section. It's like half structured and like half chaotic. So all of the planning of the subplots and like thinking about how all those work is like quite structured. And how they're going to work. It's really that chapter planning that is a lot up to you and your style of writing and your style of planning and how that works for you. But if you look on my little sheet, I'll flash up some of the points up here. What I write down for these chapter plannings is not very detailed at all. It is extremely basic. It is very baseline. This is just kind of my style because I'm, you know, more of a mix of plotter and pantser, though I'm trying to be a lot more plot heavy. But that is just kind of how I block out the fun and games, because that's what makes it easiest. Because I just find that when I'm writing the fun and games section, I like to kind of have flexibility to change things while working within that framework. And so these aren't like super detailed chapter plans. It's just kind of like a little line about what's going to happen in each section. And then usually when I go in and I do my more detailed chapter edits, I'll like put a bullet point underneath, and then I'll write a very detailed breakdown of everything that's going to happen in the chapter. But this is kind of the baseline of how I plan fun and games and what I wanted to share with you, because I think that makes it the most accessible, because people that are more pantsers can kind of be like, okay, yeah, I'll just like write a line about whatever subplot is going to come in this section, and that's how I'll plan my chapters. And if you're more plotter, then you can look at that and say, okay, I'm going to write in a bunch of details underneath about what's going to happen in each chapter. So I hope that kind of makes it more accessible for each type of writer. That's it for this breaking down the fun and games. Again, in the description, I have that link to that cheat sheet that you can take and save and print and do what have you with. Just like, I guess, don't like sell it to someone because it's not yours to sell. Yeah, so don't do that, but it's available for you if you ever want to look back on this. I hope that this helped you. Again, this is just my process that I find works really well for me. I hope that you can at least take some things from this that you can like maybe make work for yourself, that you can incorporate into your own system. But I just thought this would be helpful because I hear so many people talk all the time about how difficult it is for them to write fun and games, about how vague it is. And I used to feel exactly like that until I came up with this process. And now it is so much easier for me to figure out the fun and game section. It is still a pain because it's just middle of books are pains, but it's so much easier for me to plot it out than it ever used to be in the past. And it's because I'm using this system. So I hope that this will be helpful to you. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And if you have any questions about this, like definitely comment with them and I will try and answer to the best of my ability. I have tried to make this video as clear as possible, but some things are a little bit vague, so I totally understand if you have questions. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!